Now we are moving into priority area 1 instead of in terms of the adaptation strategies. Here we are going to look at if I start, yes, we are recording here. Let's see, facilitate the adaptation of people and firms. Okay, lead ministry could be economy, but it depends. I suspect as we go forward and climate change becomes part of the mainstream decision making for all sectors, then there may be new ministries being formed as well. Adaptation is not the sole responsibility of the government. All private actors, households and firms have an incentive to minimize the impacts of climate change on their own well-being or productivity. Seems obvious, but there will always be those who cannot cope. The government's role is to ensure that all actors, especially the poorest and the most vulnerable, can access the resources they need to adapt to climate change and maximize the efficiency of the adaptation process. Three main constraints prevent the private actors from taking adaptation actions: access to data and technologies, access to financing instruments and resources, and the need to coordinate with the other actors. The latter is a challenge in the absence of public action or facilitating institutions such as business associations. These have already been manifest also in terms of farmers needing extension agencies to translate forecasts and other advisories into language they understand, for example, right? Early warnings, etc. It's the so-called last mile problems. In terms of screening questions for taking action, identify actions to enable firms and people to adapt. People need to be empowered to take effective adaptation and risk management decisions, but do they have the information, tools, and resources they need? The firms that provide goods, services, and jobs also need to adapt so that they can offer people sustainable and resilient livelihoods. Are they on track to do so? The following questions can help decision makers identify shortcomings and guide them towards the actions needed to enable firms and people to adapt. Right? So action 1.1 under this then goes as this: data and information. Have comprehensive climate and risk assessments been completed? These include hazard maps for the most important threats and that they are publicly available. Is the uncertainty on current and future risks publicly communicated? This should include several contrasted scenarios for possible future climate changes which are available to inform on uncertainty in climate projections. Okay. Can all economic actors and public agencies access data on natural risk at an affordable cost and in a practical format? These could include open risk data repositories that are available. Okay. Responsibilities and incentives as action 1.2. Are roles and responsibilities for disaster and climate risk management clearly defined so that flow of information and actions are very military drill-like and always systematically executed? These could include presence of a designated disaster management authority. A disaster risk management framework law is passed clarifying responsibility and liabilities. So there is accountability associated with that as well if there are failures in the execution. Does the country have institutions and agencies in charge of managing shared resources? This could include watershed agency that is established to share water across various users, so management of resources which can then be planned for the near term and the longer term. Do private actors know the level of residual risk they are exposed to and the level of protection offered by public infrastructure and instruments? Remember, we had intolerable risks that are taken care of the service provider, maybe a private company for infrastructure, water, food, whatever, transportation, and then there are residual risks of shocks that are unavoidable, which becomes government's responsibility. Maps of residual risks accounting for public flood defenses are available as an example. 1.3, Technology and innovation. Has the government addressed trade barriers that limit the use of essential technologies? So if you need air conditioning, which is not a good idea, as the warming increases, people would want to buy air conditioning, but you want energy efficient air conditioners as well as the ones that are replacing HFCs in due time. So the trade barriers cannot prevent people from using these. So average tariff on disaster management technology or goods matter in this case. Are policies in place to actively support adopting or developing new technologies for resilience? Existence of an investment in an agriculture extension program matters in this case. Action 1.4, financing and support to the poorest and most vulnerable people. Can private actors access adequate financing for adaptation-related investments? Is the government providing specific financing instruments to facilitate people's investments in adaptation and risk reduction? This could include volume of financing in windows targeting climate change adaptation. Has the government identified and started supporting the most vulnerable population groups whose poverty prevents them from adapting to climate change? Have actions been taken to mitigate the most severe impacts of climate change? Do vulnerable groups have access to affordable financial instruments that can help them manage risks and reduce their own vulnerability? These could include total amount of resilience support to poor, vulnerable communities. Okay, this is kind of a base level service that the government has to provide. Action 1.5, strategic structural transitions. Does the government have policies in place to actively manage the strategic decline of sunset sectors? Again, sunset sectors are, let's say, fossil fuels in general, coal in particular, or internal combustion engines, and so on. These could include skill retraining schemes and social protection, so that when coal goes out, the coal workers are protected or retrained to engage in other sectors. Is the economy diversified rather than being concentrated in one sector that may be vulnerable? If everybody is in the labor market or in agriculture or some other service sector, construction or whatever, and if climate change shifts those jobs or makes them obsolete, then there could be trouble if economy is not diversified. So these could include share of exports in one agricultural commodity. So if a community is entirely dependent on growing coconuts and exporting them, and coconuts become hammered by the climate change, then one has to be ready for that community to be doing something else. Does the country have a diversification strategy based on either assets such as investments in education or active industrial policies? Okay. Let me leave this here, and then we can come back and look at the details in terms of the actions. So assessing disaster and climate risks and making the information available is action 1.1. So there are many details here we want to read more carefully, so maybe I should do that starting in the next podcast. Even though this one is slightly short, it's okay. So you can just look at the summary of the actions, and then we will go into the details of each one of them. Okay, so we'll see you in the next podcast.